Hello, it's very nice to be back. I have to say that I'm also still a visiting professor here, so that means that you're entitled to call on me or not call on me whenever you need to, or don't need to, as the case may be. Right, so I've configured this onto my tiny. I'm just going to increase this so I can see it. I'm very happy for people to leave in order to go to the demo if they want to. So please don't feel that it will be impolite on my behalf. I just say that. Okay. So as Suhail said, I'm going to be talking directly about a number of artistic or curatorial or art institutional platforms tonight. Probably the best way to frame them. So I'm going to be talking about the organisation of arts institutions and the way in which, as Suhail said in his introduction, there has been a migration over the past 20 years towards the forming of platforms. And in fact, the term platform is as regularly used in art as it is in other kind of forms of usually considered to be leftist, oppositional forms of political organisation. Obviously, we're used to the term financial platform, and we're used to many other ways in which the term platform is organised, but I'm going to be talking today about the way in which the concept of the platform has been introduced and mobilised within arts institutional discourse as something that is opposed to a sovereign or singular position. It's opposed somehow to a kind of quasi-normative understanding of artistic autonomy and artistic sovereignty. And the question I will be asking following Suhail's introduction is whether or not that's the case. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about a group of organisations called... Where's that from?
Sorry.
I could talk about the Lysander International Research Centre for Art.
This is from Renzo Martin's talk. Sorry.
I actually could do a Renzo Martin's lecture, but if you've done it already, then no point.
Sorry, Ray.
It's all right. I'm happy to improvise. I'll come back to this, but many of you might have seen if you subscribe to and receive on a regular basis Flux announcements into your email or on Facebook. So, as I was saying, I'm going to talk particularly about an artistic platform or shared organisational structure called the International or l'Internazionale, which is a compendium or a consortium of a number of European reaching out to forms of globalisation, but mainly in logistically European arts organisations. Can I ask if anybody has worked with or knows anything about l'Internazionale or the International? Has anybody come across it? Yeah? A few people? Got a few nods? I mean, I would guess particularly within those of you that are looking at curating, it's quite a kind of dominant platform at the moment. So I'm going to talk about that, but before I do, and I'm going to use it as kind of a case study for us to be able to explore this question of whether the platform, the artistic platform, is what I'm calling a weak form of power, and I will describe what I mean by a weak form of power, or indeed whether it is a fictitious form of power that is there to somehow exacerbate the potency or the legitimization of potencies of its subscribers, or whether indeed it's a kind of fake, as in a fake fact. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to have to crouch down a bit to read most of this because I've written it too small. So this talk is about institutional change. So I don't know whether anybody is familiar with the work I've been doing over the past couple of years, but really I've been working with a lot of organisations, both international and actually very national. I mean, I've been working with a lot of British small-scale arts organisations to try and develop ways in which small-scale arts, small to medium-scale arts organisations can think about institutional change. So that is not only the way in which they work with artists, but the way in which they're legislatively organised and structured, the way in which they work with the powers that come with things like charity commissioning, with the ways in which they might work with forms of trusteeship, sponsorships, forms of national and international funding. So this has been a lot of my activity over the past couple of years, and it's feeding into the book that Sue mentioned, which is a book around art and inequality, art and the production of inequality. But what I want to talk about now is in arts institutions and their potential to change. It's not only about publicly funded art institutions, although they're the ones that I mainly work with, and the ones that are part of L'Internazionale are all publicly funded art organisations. L'Internazionale receives its money from the European funds. For the sake of transparency, you need to know that I'm a trustee of many arts organisations and I'm the advisory board of them, so I'm kind of also imbricated in forms of power that I will be seeking to open up and explore. And in fact, my role as trustee, as advisor, as colleague, as collaborator is, it gives me my material to work with. It's a form of ethnography, one could say. So the Internationale, or the International, or L'Internazionale, was set up, it began to be set up about a decade ago, and it was set up as a consortium of organisations who include the Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the MACBA in Barcelona, the Muka in Antwerp in Belgium, SALT in Istanbul and Ankara in Turkey, and the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, the Netherlands. That's the kind of main caucus of the organisation. So they're pretty well-known and very well-established organisations, some of which are larger than others in the sense that they employ more people and they produce more art. They're all commissioning organisations. They're also what are known as receiving houses, so they also kind of receive exhibitions and events that are programmed by others, so they work in collaboration. And of course, part of the international, part of L'Internazionale, is a way of empowering that form of subscription, that form of negotiation between institutions. They also work with a number of educational institutions. In fact, educational institutions, not Goldsmiths, but educational institutions that are familiar to us. And they also work with what they call kind of satellites, or how do I change this? Like this. Okay. Yeah. Hang on, I'm going to go to this. If I do this, will it go to the...
No, you'll have to come out of the presentation.
Oh.
You have to escape the presentation and make the link.
If you could get that going while I talk, that'd be great.
You'll have to escape.
I'm just going to get the Internationale website up. And they work with a number of other satellite organisations and thinkers and writers, and they have a map which I'm about to show you that displays their kind of geographical reach and their aims. Okay, so what you will see, because I'm going to show you in a minute, is some of the rhetoric that Internationale proposes. So what they propose is that they want to produce, and I'm quoting now from the website that I hope you'll be able to see in a minute. Oh, thank you. Is
It's launched at another window.
It's launching another window. So is it going to come up? Sorry. So what they propose is a space for art within a non-hierarchical and decentralized internationalism based on the values of difference and horizontal exchange among a constellation of cultural agents, locally rooted and globally connected. Okay, so this is the kind of main aim of Internationale, and there you can see the details of this. You can see a few more of the partners there as well. Okay, so I'll read out that as well, because in a way the language they use around the platform is, I think, very important and possibly might produce a kind of connective tissue with some of the other languages that have been used around sovereignty and platforming in the past lectures. So again, I'll read it. L'Internazionale proposes a space for art within a non-hierarchical and decentralized internationalism, based on the values of difference and horizontal exchange among a constellation of cultural agents, locally rooted and globally connected. They go on to say, as you can see in the top of the second paragraph of their description here, the ethics of L'Internazionale are based on the values of difference and antagonism, solidarity and commonality. And then they carry on and say, L'Internazionale also serves as an apparatus for making visible the standardization of individual and collective beings, and defends the critical imagination of art as a catalyst in times of crisis for concepts of the civic institution, citizenship, and democracy. And obviously they take their name, so the language they use around them is precise, but it's also a language that we're used to as a kind of oppositional language to capitalist sovereignty and neoliberalism that is pretty rampant throughout the arts and culture in particular. So when they say things like they want the power to question and challenge their systems, when they want to defend the critical imagination, when they want to use art as a catalyst in times of crisis for concepts of the civic institution, citizenship and democracy, these are forms and terms that are used by most institutions, whether they are part of a platform or not. So this is the kind of language that is what I would call a kind of normative language that arts institutions use to signal that they are opposing or oppositional to forms of capitalism and liberal democracy that they would like to presuppose are not part of their existence and not part of their funding structures, etc., etc. So at once, you know, L'Internazionale is making bold claims about itself and its power, and I would say that many of the organisations that are part of it, of that list of organisations that I read out just now, have been in trouble in the past because they have harboured protests, they have exacerbated antagonisms and anti-governmental politics in their various constituencies. So to a certain extent, a lot of these institutions come with a legacy of a broad identification with left-wing politics. Obviously, they get their name from the socialist anthem, L'Internazionale, which they say calls for an equitable and democratic society with reference to the historical labour movement. So they are also very firmly signalling their coherence and allegiance and continuation of a very important and very significant, although unsuccessful, one could say, although David Mabb might disagree with me.
No, in a way it's a real watering down.
Yeah.
Because they're referring to the Internationale, which is the hymn of the communist movement.
Yeah.
But that in itself is used by the first international set up by Marx, second international which split over the First World War, third international, movements of the international communist movement,
Yeah.
fourth international, failure of the Trotskyist sects that came out of that. So actually this is a sort of watering down of what the international actually represented, because it was always a communist movement, and that's not what's being referenced here.
No, of course not.
Sorry.
Well, I say of course not, But I mean, there's a very clear non-alignment that is going on. And in fact, the political institution that they do mention, not necessarily in their mission statement, but in some of the articles that they've commissioned that you can see on their website, is the non-aligned movement. So significantly different from the history, the communist history, although related to the communist history that David's just very quickly and rather brilliantly described for us. They associate themselves with non-alignment. So the idea of a non-aligned movement, so non-aligned movements coming together, particularly in Yugoslavia in 1961, to organise different forms of power outside of global sovereignties, of internationalism that were there seen very much at large. And there's actually a lot of really interesting research and curating that's gone on over the past 10 years looking at the non-aligned movement, and if anybody's interested, I'm happy to give people references to that. So it's a kind of slightly different political trajectory that the Internazionale, despite its coining of this communist term, is equating itself with. So we could say that this organisation, which seeks not only to swap works, to co-commission, to commission articles for its website, to draw attention to values that are non-capitalist, is also attempting to reframe something as a platform, to come back to Suhail's idea for this particular part of the lecture series. So it's trying to reorganize concepts of solidarity. Solidarity is also a term they use, and reorganize modes of power as a transversal or a horizontal, the term they use is horizontal platform of power sharing, as opposed to a kind of sovereignty of institutionality, which is normally supposed to take place within arts institutions. So the question is a simple one, really, which is the international, l'Internazionale, successful in this regard? Is it something that is the way in which arts institutions and artists and curators and directors associated with those institutions should be moving towards as an organisational form in order to reconfigure the financial, the economic, the financial, the hierarchical powers that exist within most major and minor arts institutions through the various things that I've described already, such as the laws that they are governed by, the boundaries within which they have to operate or choose to operate, and the mechanisms through which they hire and fire people, including artists and curators. Is it an alternative to that, or is it an expanded version of more of the same? Now, in this short opening up of these ideas before we get on to have a conversation about it, I will say now that I haven't made up my mind. I don't know whether it is a platform that is a confection of neoliberalism, one could say, or whether there is something with this institutional framework that does suggest an alternative and viable organised form of power sharing that offers a model of potential, I don't like that word potential, offers a model offers a model, let's leave it at that, offers a model that could be reconfigured or expanded to produce alternative forms of power at a very particular moment when we need it. So, I've used the term in my title, weak power. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I mean by weak power before I come back to the international. Sorry, I'm mixing up my English and French pronunciations. So, of course, weak power is a kind of oxymoron or a non sequitur or whatever. I'm looking at people who will tell me exactly the right one to use in this relationship. Weak power is, if one takes it as a dictionary definition, there is no such thing as weak power. It's interesting, when you Google weak power, what you get is endless websites that tell you how to increase the power going into your electricity sockets, etc., etc. So You know, obviously it has some currency, pardon the pun, in relationship to certain forms of thinking about power, which is as power is generated, often through, you know, kind of illegal means to power our supplies, to power our websites, to power everything else. So that's what you get if you Google the weak power. However, I want to talk about weak power in another kind of way. It occurs to me that the arts in general never claim forms of power that are direct, and never claims of power that are directly aligned to political movements, or do very rarely. I mean, of course, historically there are moments at which they have, but they are anomalies within a general causation or general situated art history. So we can say that generally art does not propose strong power for itself. Art, and more importantly, for me, in this talk tonight, because I'm not talking about artists and artworks, I'm talking about art institutions don't claim strong power. One could say that International is kind of moving that way, but still looking at the language that is used within its environments, within its rhetoric, within its websites. It isn't claiming strong power. It's claiming the power of de-hierarchization, it's claiming the power of horizontality, and it's claiming powers of complexity, all of which I would ascribe to what I'm trying to describe as weak power. So a parallel question I would have about this platform, and I've already said to you I haven't made up my mind whether this platform is a good thing or a bad thing, generally speaking, in terms of art being able to reconfigure itself, or arts institutions being able to reconfigure themselves in order to fight very important political battles that are being fought hopefully outside 10 Downing Street now. Along with that question, I also have a question about whether this concept of weak power might be a form of power that has puissance, has some versioning that is potential, that has legs, has a way that we can be motivated through. Now, I'm not sure that having said what I've just said, I think that that is a kind of common claim within art. It's common for art to claim weak power. So art commonly won't claim direct power, it will claim indirect power. You know, this is an installation that evokes forms of inequality. This isn't an installation that changes the patterns of inequality within the particular cultural context in which it finds itself or is placed. So Theresa May didn't go to Trump offering the UK's cultural institutions as collateral for a free trade agreement last week. She went offering the NHS and our minor weapons industries. And Donald Trump is not banning artists or the directors of art institutions from entry into the US. As Suhail says, he's banning a very different group of people who might or might not include, I've lost all of my presentation, might or might not include artists. In fact, there's an artist in the room tonight who is potentially included in that group. No. So in those senses, art has weak power, or it is weak. I mean, maybe it doesn't have any power at all. We could talk about that. So the questions that arise from this kind of coining of the concept of weak power have completely disappeared from my PowerPoint. Not from my PowerPoint, from my lecture. So let me see if I will just improvise it. Okay, so let's go back to this. So everybody's clear about what International is. It's not a particularly, there's nothing much more to it than that, except for the kind of things I've explained to you occur within it, and except for the claim, the clear claim within it that this is a way that art organisations can get together to form different forms of kind of collateral in the face of emerging or continuing new neoliberalisms and emerging neo-capitalisms. So if we go back to this concept of weak power, I get this term weak power from Adorno and Horkheimer, but I'm kind of using it in a different way from the way that they do. So they say in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, in the essay on the cultural industries, in that book, or that collection of essays, the cultural industry essay was originally written in 1944, they say this: if the objective social tendency of this age is incarnated in the obscure subjective intentions of board chairmen, this is primarily the case in the most powerful sector of industry: steel, petroleum, electricity, chemicals. Compared to them, the cultural monopolies are weak and dependent. They have to keep in with the true wielders of power to ensure that their sphere of mass society, the specific product of which still has too much cosy liberalism and Jewish intellectualism about it, is not subjected to a series of hurdles. So obviously, racism emerges from that statement. But aside from that, what Adorno and Horkheimer are basically saying is that arts institutions and cultural product doesn't have the power of powerful sectors of industry such as steel, petroleum, electricity, chemicals, etc. And of course that needs to be read within its context of 1944 in Europe. We can also compare this to a much more recent text called The Art of Rent, written in 2012 by the Marxist geographer David Harvey, who says, after a long description of whether artists and oppositional art organizations have any power, he says, it is one thing to be transgressive about sexuality, religion, social mores, and artistic and architectural conventions, but quite another to be transgressive in relation to the institutions and practices of capitalist domination that actually penetrate deeply into cultural institutions. So in a way, both of them, from very different perspectives, are saying the same thing, which is that institutions that are involved in the organization of art, culture more generally, are institutions that have a weakness, that can't compete in terms of powerful, monopolistic, transnational networks with stronger industries or the industries that capture them. Now, it would seem to me that International are attempting to suggest something that is more like the forms of power that we find in industries than the forms of power that are normally understood to emanate from or be produced by arts institutions, whether they be large ones like the Reina Sofia and WUKA and the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, or whether they be smaller ones, small organizations that we might be more closely wrapped up in. So the question is, can they make that claim? Is there any form of claim within it? My interest is in, rather than, I'd like to discuss these questions with you, but rather than discussing the question, me adding more into that question, what I've been doing over the past few years is thinking quite closely about how, given David Harvey's statement about the relative lack of power within arts organizations and their capture within a broader framework of governmentality and a broader framework of management, is to think about how management might be a site, management and administration might actually be the site of powerful change and powerful recalibration that the arts organizations could do, and therefore something that maybe could be the next step for a platform or organization like International. One thing to say about International is that it is kind of setting itself up in opposition to a number of other organizations like the Biannual Foundation or the International Biannual Association, that are large conglomerates of powerful industrial players within the art world who come together using very similar language to the language that International use, but are moving it in ways that are about self-organisation, self-promotion, and funding, and kind of circular funding, which of course International are also doing. So the question would be, you know, is there a connection or not a connection between those two things? Obviously, there are lots of connections between the players of the International Biannual Association and International. But I'm more interested in what the late Mark Fisher called the idea of moving away from managerialism and moving back towards, and he writes about this with Alex Williams and individually as well, back towards concepts of management as power. So my question to something like the International would be, rather than talking about transversality and horizontality and de-hierarchization, how is it possible for them themselves as organizations to demonstrate that they are taking their rhetoric within their organizations themselves? So I've got up here a manifesto for institutional change that I've presented in a number of places, and not all of it is directly related to the International, and it hasn't been written specifically with the International in mind. But I am very interested in the ways in which planning and management come to the fore as paradigms that need to be changed in arts institutions. And I am also interested in the ways in which International could be a site that would take on board paradigms of institutional change. After all, they do say in their rhetoric, and I don't think I lost this bit, yes, International declares that art and its institutions have the power to question and challenge their own specific systems, as well as the formal structures of institutions in general, and to be an appropriate platform for the discussion of a renewed social contract. So again, language that is taken from histories of socialism. It intends to rehearse new protocols and provide decentered models that transcend the bureaucratic and self-referential structure of cultural institutions. So I'm thinking, what do they need to do in order to do it? So I think some of the things that they could do are in this list. And some of them are very pragmatic and practical, and some of them are not. Some of them would require a lot more effort. And all of them are have clear implications for the economic organisation of the institutions themselves. In fact, all of them need a certain form of economic transparency in order to reorganise themselves. And I hope that fits a little bit with some of the things that have been said previously. So, as well as adopting equal pay systems and paying artists and all institutional collaborators, which of course most institutions don't do, and most biannuals don't do. There are other things that these institutions might be able to do. For instance, you cannot adopt certain forms of cooperation if you're managed by charity status. You cannot receive money from certain types of organisational funding if you don't have certain regulations in place, if you don't have a director and you don't have a hierarchical power system. So there are many, many things like that that could easily be challenged by an organisation such as International, and it could be challenged through this kind of bifurcation of what I'm calling weak power. So I think I will leave it there now, because I think I've probably already been talking for longer than I said I would, and open it up to questions and thoughts and ideas. Partly because I lost everything on my computer. But apart from that, it's fine. So I'll leave it there. So, oh yeah. Well, I started off and I ended with art strike images. So the first one, because of course the other form of power that art has performed in various different ways for 2 centuries is the strike. And there's a long history of art strikes. I don't have time to go into them now. I'm sure people have maybe been involved in art strikes in the past. But this was the strike that was called last week, week before last, for all arts organisations to stop work on the day of the inauguration of Trump. So that's why it's called J20, January 20. This was the image that was sent round by the Queen's Museum, and this is the rhetoric that was sent round by the Queen's Museum in New York as one of the participatory institutions that went on art strike on January the 20th. So it's, you know, about making signs and organising things. And I kind of think some of these things are quite interesting. And then, of course, this last one is Stuart Home's art strike from 1990 to 1993, in which he made no work with a number of other people for 3 years, which was more of a kind of rhetorical art strike, although politically it was meant as a direct, non-weak power structure. But it had very, very little effect on the established art world. So I guess the question I would have to end would be something like, what's the chance that an organisation like l'Internazionale can have more power, direct effect on the organised art world than things like art strikes? I'll leave that. Thank you.
I'll ask a couple of questions, as usual, just to start off, and then open up for questions on the floor. Around weak power. It seems to be I couldn't quite make the move from the quotes that you gave, which were, seem to be suggesting essentially that actors in the art field need to comply with like the sort of dominant forms of power in capitalist societies, like either industrial or corporate, urban, in the case of David Harvey, in order to kind of maintain their own viability in the social space and so on. So the argument there is that cultural institutions are weak with respect to dominant forms of power in capitalism. That's the kind of necessary mode they must adopt. And so is the question you're asking whether this kind of decentralized, non-hierarchical, so on and so forth of l'Internazionale, whether that is one of those kinds of subservient forms of weak power? Or are you asking, well, I don't know, what's the relationship between the power, the organizational and institutional format of proposed by l'Internazionale as in relationship to weak power?
Right. So I think there's 2 moves. Okay, the first move is to ask the question: is this thing that I'm calling weak power, which is described in various different ways by Horkheimer, Adorno, and Harvey, slightly, I mean, they've been taken from quite different contexts, those quotes. Is that, is there a, because actually what's interesting about both of those, all those 3 writers, is they have a firm belief in art. Okay, so as most people should know definitely about Horkheimer and Adorno, maybe less so with David Harvey. David Harvey really believes that art is can be transformative, particularly kind of urban guerrilleristic kind of art. So the first move is to say, is there a different way of reading the kind of power of art, the weak power, as a form that has a potential through organisational structure, a structure like Internazionale, to enact different forms. And then the second move is to say, if there is, then what does something like Internazionale have to do in order to promote and push forward those things? And what I see as the sticking point, effectively, currently in this, sorry I didn't explain this well because I missed my notes, is the fact that at the moment the claims of Internationale and a number of other platforms as well, I mean I think they're not dissimilar to the International Biannual Association, for instance, on one level, is a claim about content and a claim about a language of anti-capitalism, but is not a claim about the forms and mechanisms of management and structure, and that might be the way to reconceptualize something like weak power.
So it's kind of outward facing rather than
Yes,
inward facing.
absolutely.
It doesn't take its own power mechanisms.
It needs,
Within the art field.
it would need to in order to
Yeah.
reconfigure itself. Yeah.
Okay, all right. And then the second question as a lead. The phrase weak power reminds me of soft power.
Yeah.
So soft power, for those of you who don't know, in the days of good old peak neoliberalism from the early 2000s, late 90s, was proposed by, I think, a diplomat or some kind of diplomat, political theorist called Joseph Nye.
Yeah.
And it was actually set up in the Clinton period. And his argument was that what needs to happen at that point of the 90s is not sort of a hard military power. The kind of thing that's coming back now, or being imposed now. It's not sort of a neo-imperial expansion into poorer countries and sort of extraction, so on and so forth. What you have to do is kind of, it's a hearts and minds strategy. And one of the key components in the soft power argument is cultural connection. So America becomes an attractive place because it supports a lot of liberal claims. It's kind of cultural expansion, it's very welcoming. So it kind of fits in with the cultural globalisation model. And so, but there's a sense with soft power in which people like Nye, and I think he had quite an influence in transforming the American the American model of capitalist expansion from a hard militaristic one through Reagan onwards to the kind of softer, globalized international community, United Nations model, where everything is actually quite decentralized, quite communicative. It's something like the rhetoric of International.
And also people like Florida, and I mean,
yeah, that sort of stuff. So, but the contrast, I guess, would be that Nye and others who kind of took up that model, and Florida does it within the city, understand art and culture to be quite powerful. That actually you can replace some of the effects or kind of some of what hard power is trying to do. You can replace that and be better at doing those things through soft power because it's inclusive. So, the version of it would be recently around the return of waterboarding that Trump is advocating. He's saying he's going to hand over to the guy who's going to run the Defense Department, who says, I don't need to torture people, just give me a pack of cigarettes and beer, and I'll take care of it. That's going to solve power. And actually you extrapolate that to like a geopolitical strategy. And it's the same thing. Essentially that for all of the weakness of art and culture, to expand it, in relationship to the hard industries, if you know, or the strong power, there still seems to be, it has been anyway, like a kind of platform or a plank on which sort of large power configurations kind of have an emphasis. Open society, Soros Foundation, and so on. They're very keen on cultural promotion. So just whether for you there's a dichotomy or a paradox or something between soft power and weak power.
I don't know whether it's a dichotomy or a paradox, but I do recognise that what I'm trying to do with this concept of weak power is to ask a question of it, which is there another way that it could be a power? Because I recognise that in the kind of cultural capital argument, in terms of my soft power, in terms of Florida, and I mean also in the way that someone like David Harvey uses it, that it is whether they're from the left or from the right or however, even if we can even talk about those divisions anymore, that there is an understanding that it's better to do that art plays a role, arts institutions particularly, because that's what I'm interested in here, play a part in that, and that they are therefore players in a broader configuration of powers, or an overarching form of power. So I understand that, but my question is, my question is, if that's the case, which seems fairly evident, I mean, many people have written about it, and it's a fairly convincing argument, then is there another way in which these things that are dotted around the landscape of the globe called arts institutions, be they the group that have come together under the banner of l'Internazionale, or indeed, slightly more difficult to imagine for me, the International Biannual Association, and because I think the players and the rhetoric is slightly different. Is there a way in which this form of weak power can be remodified or reperformed in a way that begins to enact different modes of preparatory, performed actions, ongoing daily work? It's what somebody like Keller Easterling calls the unheroic work of substructures. And I'm kind of interested in that as being a kind of another version of weak power.
All right, questions?
You mentioned assault in Istanbul. I wonder if you could just, from that area and artist thinking how to respond when it looks like the
Yes.
Speak up.
But Turkey is already under a totalitarian system. It's been getting that way for a while. How has it been affected? How have they responded to it? Because I went around Seoul and it felt like something was missing there. It was strange. I mean, I don't know, but it felt like I can always be like, oh, you can't show that kind of work. I don't know if that's how that kind of thing to do.
Yes, in Turkey they do, and the director of SALT, Basit Kortan, has to toe a very careful line in order to get to keep his organisation afloat. However, SALT is also privately funded, so it's funded by the Galata Bank, and both its branches, both the one in Istanbul and the one in Ankara, are privately funded. It receives money from co-commissioning. You know, it's not all privately funded. Obviously, if it funds something with this bunch of other institutions, then that would be an EU fund, for instance, which is nominally not private. But I think that SALT is protected within the Turkish context by its private funding to a certain extent. But I think that if you went around a number of Turkish institutions, and certainly my experience in Turkey, or not the whole of Turkey, but the only cities I really know are Istanbul and Ankara, is that there is a very gentle and very there's a very kind of negotiated relationship with what is made visible, what becomes visible. I mean, I don't know whether I answered your question. I mean, obviously, in Turkey, activists would say that there was a lot of censorship.
Can you say what negotiated relationship to what becomes visible means? It's a kind of very euphemistic description of process.
What did I say? Negotiated relationship with what becomes visible.
And is it that gentle though? I mean, I guess
No, it's not. I don't think. I'm not trying to say it's gentle.
Right. I guess I'm experiencing.
I mean, there's nothing. No exhibition is gentle. You get selected or you don't. It's horrible. It's violent. Yeah. It's not like, the Tate isn't gentle. It's like you're either in there or you're out the door. You either get an invite or you don't get an invite.
Don't get paid either way.
No.
Don't get paid either way.
And you don't get paid either way at the Tate. You probably
so sad. There's a question.
Not because they have no money. Come on.
Thanks, Andrea. I wanted to sort of get back to the sort of structural formation of both this organization and what will make it a platform. Because it strikes me that a platform already has a sort of a managerial structure built into the concept, which enacts a very direct power, rather than a sort of weak power, on all that is within its platform. Whereas a confederation, or under the banner of kind of confederation, would seem to indicate, relatively autonomous sovereigns coming together under the banner of. So Perhaps are you asking the question of whether this could become a platform because platforming is a kind of a verb, right? You platform something to gain power or gain a kind of direct power. So is that what you're asking, or is it already a platform? What makes it a platform?
Let me paraphrase the question for people who may not heard it. So Ramona's asking about the term platform, with which I introduced, you took it up, so it's fair to ask you. And Ramona's point was that platforms are forms of structural organization which impose something that happens upon them. So if you're using Facebook or Google, you're kind of defined in a very direct way by what the platform is. And the organization here seems to not operate in that way, but it seems to be more coalition of autonomous agents. So you have like different institutions which have their own statutes and regulations and so on and so forth, happen in different countries, connected by some kind of pan-Europeanness, which of course no one includes Britain, so there's no British organizations in there.
Well, there is actually NEMA as a...
is that one of the main?
No, it's not a main one.
Right.
It's,
Which is a true relationship you were in.
yeah.
So the Ramon's question was why Andrea was using the word platform, because it seems too imposing a kind of notion for what's been set up in the internet now.
I think you're right, Ramon, that it does claim itself as a confederation rather than a platform. I'm not sure about the distinction you make. I mean, I understand that a confederation is largely understood as a group of individual entities coming together to do a specific thing or whatever, and platform. But I'm not sure, I mean, we'd have to talk, and maybe you've already covered this in this lecture series, that platform is a more direct form of organisational power distribution. Next week, okay. So I'm not sure whether I think that is platform, but you know, we could argue the case of that. But I do think that it's interesting to read the International as a platform, because I think the things it's claiming to do are platforming. I mean, they're not coming together as a confederation just to help publicise themselves or to circulate commissions or the normal ways in which, if you think of an organisation like Plus Tate, for instance, which is, I don't know whether people are familiar with Plus Tate, but Plus Tate is a kind of the way that Tate has organised itself as an umbrella for a number of national organisations. People familiar with this? So most of the kind of main regional galleries across England now are part of Plus Tate. That is a confederation, and what they do is they tour Tate exhibitions, and they become analogous to Tate in many different ways. I mean, it's a long conversation to have about Tate Plus, but that I would say is a confederation. Tate Plus, or actually it's now called Plus Tate, somewhat confusingly, doesn't have a kind of a set of political demands that it makes, or it doesn't say, in the manner that International does, we want to promote horizontal modes of thinking and realign ourselves with the non-aligned movement. And, do you see what I mean? So I think in that sense, yeah?
That also sounds like Tate Plus is a platform. Is a classic sort of definition of platform, not having any political manifesto. So
Okay.
Maybe there's two different variations of platform, but maybe just describing what is International, how it's organized, is interesting.
Well, it's organised it gets a grant of EU money. It's just about to apply for a new grant. So the first one was a 5-year grant. And through that, it employs an administrator and an online manager, and it commissions articles. And it has a long project at the moment that across the whole of the first 5 years called the Uses of Art, which was also a curatorial organisation. I mean, a curatorial project, should I say, rather than organisation. Maybe, I mean, it's possible that I have a very different idea of a platform from you. And I'm highly likely to be wrong.
This sounds really pragmatic, but do you think the International goes as far as it's possible within the current circumstances? So they're aware, even if they wanted to be a more left-leaning institution or organisation or federation of institutions, if they were to be more radical or whatever, they would actually start to lose their funding. The institutions wouldn't stay afloat, everyone would lose their jobs, or another organisation would move in to take over those institutions, another set of staff. So given the circumstances, is it just the sort of, and the language they use, they have to use just to be, they can go as far as they can go in the current circumstances, that's all they're able to do it. So it's a judgment of the limits of what's possible now. Is it more to do with that than any strong ideological or political position?
I mean, did people at the back hear that? Okay, so the question was whether the phrasing of the International's project is more to do with the compromises of the institutions, because all institutions are compromised by the funding, the kind of statutes that belong to charity states and so on, and whether the kind of partial phrase, the implicit claims, explicit claims, it has to remain implicit because of these practical considerations and pragmatics, rather than sort of deep ideological commitments to this kind of thing.
I'm sure, absolutely, of course. Now, whether it's the limit or whether it's that I mean, of course, these are all institutions that have long histories, they have huge budgets compared to the small organisations I normally work with. And yeah, they have you know, up 20 and upwards employees, they have a whole, you know, raft of things that they're protecting, of course. They're also protecting their stature, their status within an ecology of arts organisations. So they're doing all sorts of things. So yes, of course, they're going as far as they can, but I think that what's confusing about them is the fact that they are mixing that limitation with a rhetorical stance that suggests otherwise. So what I would like them to do would be to move in ways that really challenge those limits that you very rightly, I think, described. So if one of the limits, for instance, is that in order to receive EU money, you need to have a director, which, as it happens, is the case if you're an arts institution, then is it not the platform's job, to go back to Ramon's question about whether it's a platform or not, I'm not sure, but is it not the platform's job to now negotiate with the EU to move beyond Eurocentric, hierarchical and paternalistic versions of directorial acquisition than they are currently accepting. So in a way, to get back to this idea of weak power, the question is that weak power? Is this the opportunity that now presents itself to the international, or l'Internazionale as this set of organisations, which is to push those limits within the very nice little setup that is already in operation, that's very well funded, and it proposes that it wants to do more political work.
Oh, somebody's flurry of questions. There's one back. Somebody. You, yeah, you.
I'm just wondering, do you know any institution who is challenging the way to say it?
Yes, I think she just actually doing this.
I mean, the level of museums.
Yeah, I don't mean it's a museum level institutions that are making sort of challenges.
Yeah, at the level of museums, I don't, but I do know lots of small organisations that are. But that doesn't stop me from requiring museums to take this on as a challenge.
But I have the feeling that when you reach a level, that's the system of it, so you cannot expect something else.
You can always expect something else. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a question of scale. Of course, it goes back to David Harvey. Of course, there's a question of scale. It's easier to do things at a small level, at a small scale level, than it is as you scale up. Because the demands upon you that come with your funding, whether it be private or whether it be public, or, let's face it, because it's usually a mixture of both, particularly in Northern Europe, that there are more demands, and there are more demands for hierarchizations within your structure, and, for instance, you're more likely to be able to get away with not paying artists the bigger your institution is. Yeah? Because it's more, you have more privilege as an artist to have a solo show at Tate than you do a solo show at Studio Voltaire, for instance. Which is why Studio Voltaire pays its artists and Tate doesn't, usually. Yeah? So, of course, scale matters at all different levels. However, my current job and interests, I guess, or the job that I'm trying to take on with a number of small-scale organisations, is to try and reconfigure things at a very basic level, like as Suhail's mentioned and I mentioned in my talk, the concept of charity, and how charity configures a certain mode of working and a certain hierarchization of power within an institution that is demanded. It's little things, like, for instance, you can't, if you are a charity, then, and you say you set up an organisation, an art organisation, and there are 3 of you, and in order to receive Arts Council money, you need to confer to certain kind of standards, one of which is, depending on how much money you want, a charity. In order to become a charity, you need to elect a board of trustees or a board of directors who then employ you. So you can see there's all these configurations that could be changed, that could be altered. And there are organisations that have really pushed in this country the Arts Council on this. But, you know, they're small organisations. They have more interest and they have a more ideological commitment to those kind of questions than other ones are. There are lots of European institutions that are doing the same thing.
I just want to move it on a bit. So there's a question from the
There's also the question of the content of the work that these institutions support. And what reminded me of that is the other international that we had, which was the Guggenheim International, which actually came to an abrupt end when the politics of the work that was being shown in international caused them to abandon the project. And I know most of you guys know what I'm referring to. It was Daniel Buren was painting that thing, and came into a huge collapse with like minimalist and like what was his name? Flavin didn't want that, and then they said this guy's too political because he was a situationist, and the whole thing ended, right? Because actually the content kind of like collapsed that idea, which was kind of not a biennale, right? It was just every year, right? It would do these shows called international, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so the question is, what kind of content?
Oh.
The content of the work actually was.
So questions are whether any of the claims in grace making has bearing on the content of the work or the other way around, the art itself. And the example was given of
Guggenheim's International.
the Guggenheim International, and people complaining about Buren's work.
The artists.
The other artists.
Polarized the artists,
Yeah.
and then they never did the exhibition anymore.
The other artists on the boycott, Buren was invited to the International.
Well, perhaps controversially in an art school, I would say the word doesn't matter. What's interesting about international is that they equate some of their political claims with this idea of the uses of art, the art utile, conversation and exhibitions that have been going on. So they're trying to draw a parallel between them and between artists that are, I mean, for instance, something like Tanya Bruguera has been regularly programmed and worked through this. Some of the initial Reina Sofia programs with activists were initiated this internationale. So there have been content-related connections made between what we read on the website and what we go and see in the exhibitions if we were to turn up at one of these institutions. But I don't think, in terms of what I'm saying, the art, the content, has anything to do with it. I think the content is usually used as a smokescreen to stop people looking at the structure.
Can I just follow up on that? I know there's one more question, but I just want to follow up on this in relation to, in a way, what you're suggesting about intervening in the power structures. It's kind of available for someone like you, who's kind of working in these organizations, has a status, is operating the outfield at that level. And I'm kind of thinking, well, how do people who are at the beginning sort of take up some of these arguments? But what strikes me is that the discourse of the framing of the International is the standard art theory discourses. It's kind of Deleuzian, decentralized, networking, rhizomatic, blah, 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 right? So it's a standard operation, and there's something in that discourse which is stating very clearly, not just that we're not hierarchized power actors, but we don't want to be power actors at all. And your claim is, no, we are power actors, and we have to understand ourselves and intervene as power actors, not just externally, which is a different rhetoric and actually becomes much more confrontational relationship to funders and charity commissions and but also within the field itself, that actually people in the art field, it sounds like you're making an appeal that if we switch mindset, essentially, and that also requires a switch of discourses and theoretical models away from the Deleuzian, decentralized, distributed, powerlessness, even a Rancierian model,
Absolutely.
which anyone can do. And it also depends on what the art technologies are. Understanding those power actors shifts from this. I mean, in a way, you can do it in a direct relationship to institutions if you're working with them and can make claims on them, which is, I guess, for people who've been around for a long time like we have. But also, if you're newer and introduced to the field, you can make different demands. Sort of, and they're power-laden demands, or power-directed demands, power-claiming demands. But it seems to me that's a very different discourse, a very different set of claims, actually different kind of work than the ones that we're familiar with contemporary art.
Absolutely. I think that's right, and I think that what I'm not talking about is the institutional critique. I'm not talking about, this goes back to Mo's question about content. I'm not talking about filling vacuums of space with institutionally critical art. I mean, that might or might not take place. But I am talking about whatever small amounts of relationship we have with institutions, asking questions, making demands that are different, and also quite pragmatic. One of the things that I think is important to say, and because I lost my notes, I forgot to say it when we were talking, is that of course, I mean, I hope this has resonated with you already, that a lot of things I'm talking about are demands and questions that have been brought up consistently by feminism and by anti-racist struggles over the past 50 years. So in a way, I'm trying to re-look at those kind of things. So for instance, one of the debates that's been going on recently, which has produced some results, is questions of whether galleries should be, or museums should be providing creches, for example. Now that's a fantastic example of weak power in operation, yeah? So should a gallery provide a creche? If an artist or a worker in the institution or an audience member or a viewer, should there be a subsidized creche that is paid for out of the subsidy that institution gets from its government, if it does get one from its government? Now, of course, that's not a new question. That question has circulated within feminism for 50, 60 years. The question is, how can we re-engage with those questions and understand them as new versions of power that are different from what Nye describes as soft power?
So my question is in regard to the managerial structures that you're proposing the cultural organizations reconfigure. You could also say that there's an economic reality to like, let's say, a hierarchical managerial structure. You know, it's like more efficient, right? So it like costs less to employ one director rather than like a whole board that then collaborates on a decision, right? It takes less time, so there's less money to kind of spend on management.
Yeah. So
if you reconfigure that, then it might become less efficient, so then the operating cost goes up. So then the organization has less opportunities to, I don't know, put on shows, whatever.
So the appeal is to hierarchical management as an efficient model and a cost-effective model for running institutions. And if you challenge that, then there are cost implications, efficiency implications, which then feed into the program. So,
Yes.
and then there's a question followed over that.
Aren't there? I mean, I think that's, in a way, what I'm interested in. I mean, it is also has a long history in communist thought. It has a long history in terms of the organisation of living through concepts of social condensation. I mean, there's histories and histories and histories that have really tried and thought through and like kind of really thought through these kind of questions. But I am interested in an organisation that might have less money to spend on exhibitions and more money to spend on getting people together in a room to reorganise the structure of the shapes and forms that they find themselves in. I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, just to support that before we come to Justin's question. I'm involved with WAGE, the New York-based group, and one of the standard rebuttals that's given to WAGE by actually the larger institutions is that, if we start paying artists at the rates that we're describing, we have a smaller program. So we can't. Equally, if you put in a creche, which is supportive of the workers and people who go there and so on and so forth, you need to take money away from something, and it will inevitably be the exhibition program. So there is something in the demand for equity in the arts institutions, because we're famously an equitous field, which would mean a reduction in the size of the field and exhibition. Artists have got to take the hit, or not artists, but certainly exhibition and display have to take the hit, because that's where the liquidity kind of goes. It's kind of like spending capital, variable capital.
I think artists have to take the hit as well, actually. I think...
Not just artists, also curators and the whole
Artists not excluded.
But those are always the things that are used as a kind of human shield to stop the demands for more systemic justice in the field itself. So in a way, artists, and I think this comes back to the claims to the International, which seem to me pious at best, because it seems what they do is set up all the standard rhetorics of criticality, this kind of soft politicality and so on and so forth, which is a bit like, this is all for the artists. Artists make the political claims, but actually don't need to enact them, because it's happening through the art itself. So art becomes this kind of weird straw man, which kind of carries political claims as the rhetoric does, but there's no investigation of the extremely centralized and so forth.
And it filters down to everything that you and I have talked about before, and I know that you're still very interested in, which is how the art market functions as a kind of as a mechanism through which that particular form is preserved. You know, if the art market is the thing that is propelling the exhibition content of a museum or gallery of whatever size, then the exhibition space needs to be the dominant one. Yeah, so I mean, there's all sorts of kind of, everything's wrapped up.
Yeah, I think the art market is the easy target.
So it's just with reference to that notion of hierarchical structures. You know, there is, with regard to governance across sectors, there is no specific or singular charity or not-for-profit governance model that is not a direct match of the corporate model. Corporate governance, when you look at it, it's all Derek Higgs and his report about how to do it with integrity and how to do it with transparency, but it's all a corporate model. There is simply no charitable or non-profit structure that anyone is trying, it seems, that is possible. So it's kind of like, you know, meanwhile, of course, most of those boards also do it on a pro bono basis and don't get paid anything. There's a huge amount of, you know, gift economy going on here. But it's, you know, the question is how. I mean, I think the International is lip service to, you know, a form of, as you say, rhetoric. The question is it possible within boards at these levels to set up other structures whereby it can be more transparent and has a different agency and efficacy?
Yeah, that is the question, and I think it probably is. But I think it's to management and alternative management strategies that we need to turn to start answering those questions, rather than to the content of the exhibition. And that's where I'm interested in going. And really sadly, actually, I run a journal and we're about to publish a last piece that Mark Fisher wrote called, interestingly enough, Accelerate Management. And it's precisely about these things, which is actually, this is where we need to go. It's a project I now need to finish on my own.
Mark's giving a quite shadow on this series. The last question.
I have a question that's to do with language and how I was interested in how you set the scene with reading the statement from the international website, and then the manifesto used a very, very different language that's much more the language of advocacy rather than the language of academic research. So my question is, as an academic who's also very involved in organizations, how do you bring some of that language? I don't know, I'm thinking about agonistic public spaces, which is, I'm trying to use some of those theories and trying to bring them inside the discourse of the institution, but how do you do that without either watering it down or just having to transform it into the managerial language that the institution already uses?
So the question is about the two kinds of languages between the international statement, which is a kind of standard art theory speak, kind of informed by sort of Deleuzean or Muffian claims and so on and so forth, and then kind of the manifesto that you set up, which is much more straightforward, managerial and sort of didactic almost. And the question was how you translate between them, because you occupy both camps.
No, it's very good. It's a question that occupies me quite a lot. Well, first of all, I would say that management has its own complex discourse, and boy, is there a lot of Deleuzean management speak out there. So, you know, it's like, and a lot of it comes from Goldsmith, actually. So that's the first thing to say. So, okay, so there's a kind of short answer to that, which is, as I get older and more jaded and perhaps more experienced, I find that a pragmatics becomes more useful. And I am able to use my platform as an academic to talk to artist manager and curator manager and national funding policy people in ways that are able to mix those two things together. So to be able to say to them, here's an organisation that is trying to do this, and we can describe it in this way, but we can also see that there are these very basic 3 lines that could equate to something that was like a manifesto. So I think, I mean, it's difficult, but I think you have to negotiate between them. And I come from a background of teaching curating, and my feeling is that this is effectively what should be taught on curating courses. Yeah, so that the politics of the I think what Justin said about the relationship between the corporate and the charitable is very interesting here. These languages shouldn't be just accepted. They should be, as curators, we need to think through them and challenge them, and, you know, and also recognise when, you know, agonism becomes a shorthand for, I can just slot that word in there and I don't really have to justify it anymore because everybody knows what it means.
I think I'm actually probably trying to say that's very difficult to do that and to make sense of it, but of course it makes sense when you read Chantal Mouffe on radical democracy, but then it doesn't make sense if you bring that into an environment that doesn't speak that language. So I'm not saying that, it's a very difficult position to be in, but I think...
I agree, but I also think that Chantal, when she talks about art, absolutely misunderstands what artists are trying to do and absolutely misreads, like overreads the politics of certain artistic gestures, as does Jacques Rancière. I mean, you know, these guys are looking from the other perspective, in a sense. So, I think that, which isn't to say that all philosophers should be brilliant art theorists, but, you know, there's room for other voices.